Dear friends, welcome to my channel. This time it's BEREZOVETS. I titled this video Advancing Toward Peace. This is a quote in the literal sense. This quote is from a statement by Donald Trump. He made this statement, as usual, on his social network Truth Social, following a conversation of more than 2 hours with the Russian dictator. Let me remind you, before this, Trump unexpectedly called President Zelensky, with whom he obviously discussed what he was planning to talk about with Putin. After that, he called Putin, and then Trump spoke with Zelensky and European leaders. During the conversation, the leaders of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Finland, and the European Commission were present. Let's get straight to the point, as they say, without dragging things out. The participants in the conversation, meaning Trump's second call, were shocked by what they heard, according to the influential Financial Times. But first, let's quote what Donald Trump himself wrote following his talks with Putin. By the way, it should be noted that even here, Putin outpaced him. That's his usual rule. A person who is, in principle, pathologically unpunctual, he managed to be late everywhere and always, including even to a meeting, a reception at Buckingham Palace with Her Majesty the Queen of the United Kingdom at the time, and he even managed to be late to see the Pope. Here, he always tries to outpace Trump and be the first to announce the results of the negotiations. Well, as they say, the right of the first night hasn't been abolished, and the dictator follows this rule unwaveringly. The point is that you have to maintain your image and you have to show your masculinity, your leadership. So Trump calls him, that is, he summons him for a conversation, but it is always Putin who reports the results of these negotiations first. Notice this happens 100% of the time. Putin, coming out to the journalists, briefly summarized the content of this conversation. In his opinion, I emphasize in his opinion, within 3.5 minutes, stated that Russia is not refusing peaceful negotiations, but came up with a new gimmick. Now a new word has appeared, memorandum. Putin stated that a memorandum must be signed. It's unclear what kind of memorandum this is or what it should contain, but he said that Russia and Ukraine must sign some sort of memorandum. After that, there will be a ceasefire, or more precisely, a temporary ceasefire, and then peace agreements. That's the sequence of events. There's no doubt that this isn't improvised. Putin and his advisors carefully come up with some new conditions every time. If you think about it, the goal of dragging things out is being carried out without fail. Every time Putin says, yes, I agree, everything has already been agreed upon, but we just need to sign one more document. Then after everyone has gone through it all, after they've gone through 12 circles of hell, he says, wait, we still need to sign a memorandum here, a little note there, some kind of sign-up sheet here, and an approval form there. Once we sign all that, then there will be a ceasefire. In short, this is nothing more than a ploy to drag out the negotiations and to avoid a ceasefire. He also stated, in his view, Putin, that in principle the issue of ending the war should be addressed and resolved taking into account compromises from both sides. But it's clear that in Putin's version, a compromise for Ukraine means giving up 4 regions that he doesn't control, renouncing NATO membership, reducing its army, halting weapons production in Ukraine, and refusing all Western military supplies. And as a compromise, Putin will agree to negotiate, or rather agree to negotiate. That's roughly what this so-called compromise would look like. Naturally, Ukraine will never agree to that, and basically those were the main points. By the way, Putin didn't mention anything about a meeting with Trump. He just briefly said, yes, we had an agreement. After that, Peskov himself clarified things. He said that Peskov would come out now and explain everything. Peskov came out and explained that, yes, the issue of a meeting between Trump and Putin is on the agenda. So what about Trump? Trump wrote, I just finished my 2-hour phone conversation with Russian President Vladimir Putin. I believe it went very well. Russia and Ukraine will immediately begin negotiations on a ceasefire and, more importantly, on ending the war. Some media outlets translated this statement incorrectly. They wrote that they would be negotiating. No, Trump specifically wrote that they will begin negotiations on a ceasefire. In other words, this was an agreement reached during this conversation. Trump also said that the details of the negotiation process would be available only to the two parties, that is, Ukraine and Russia, and to no one else. In other words, it's as if he is no longer acting as a mediator. It gives the impression that he is removing himself from the equation. So there is Putin, there is Zelensky, they are negotiating with each other, and we supposedly are no longer playing any role here. Well, at least that's one way to interpret this statement. The tone and spirit of the conversation, Trump writes, were excellent. If that weren't the case, I would say so right now, not later. Trump, well, now we're moving on to the economy, the most interesting part. Trump stated that the potential of our economic relations with Russia is practically limitless. He also clearly stated that he intends Ukraine must in fact be rebuilt after the end of the bloodbath, the terrible bloodbath. And he promised to restore broad and comprehensive trade relations between Russia and the United States after all this. What's really interesting, though, is that what Trump promises, I'll repeat, and he says a lot, none of it fits or aligns with reality. The reality is that there are decisions made by the United States Congress, the United States Senate, the United States government, and even by many states at their own level. They made these decisions to impose sanctions. Yes, that's right. Many states have enacted their own separate sanctions. For example, completely prohibiting Russian entrepreneurs from opening businesses if they are on certain sanctions lists or other lists, along with various other restrictions. In other words, this has already reached almost the grassroots level. Naturally, even the President of the United States, the most influential person in the world, is not able to overturn this with a decision, decree, or anything else. All the more so because many of these decisions, for example, earlier during Trump's first presidential term, and later, of course, under Joe Biden, were made by a constitutional majority. That is, the president, acting solely on his own decision, cannot by himself revoke these decrees or laws, nor can he demand, so to speak, their immediate and prompt review. Yes, he can make a proposal, but it's unlikely there will be enough votes for it, especially considering that there is already a constitutional majority, including in the upper chamber, in other words, the Senate, regarding the adoption of the next sanctions package, which was prepared by Republican Senator Lindsey Graham. In addition, Trump is announcing negotiations here. He said that he informed Zelensky, as well as the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, about this. He is writing this after his conversation with Zelensky. In other words, Trump does everything himself. He doesn't trust Caroline Levitt. He literally sits down and picks out the text with his own fingers. That's why Putin came out and immediately made a statement. He already had a press release prepared. His lackey Peskov had done his job. So it gives the impression that they had already prepared everything even before this address. The talking points were ready before the conversation with Trump, so Putin simply voiced what he had already planned to discuss. But Trump, after he spoke with Putin for 2 hours, then talked with Zelensky for about an hour and with European leaders. Only after all that did he finally get around to writing this message. But Putin had already said everything. So Trump writes, I told everything to Volodymyr Zelensky, to the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, to the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, to the Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, to the Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, and to the President of Finland, Alexander Stubb, during phone conversations immediately after my talk with Vladimir Putin. And further, the Vatican, through the Pope, expressed particular interest in holding these negotiations on its territory. Let the process begin. By the way, Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, has already fully supported this. And here is the memorandum that Putin brought up today. Russia is ready to work with the Ukrainian side on a memorandum dedicated to a possible future peace agreement, stated the Kremlin dictator. By the way, Trump didn't say anything about this memorandum, didn't say a word, so apparently he considered it insignificant, unlike the dictator, who, I'll repeat once again, attaches great importance to these procedural points that allow him to postpone or drag out decisions every time. Finally, a Financial Times publication, citing a source who participated in the conversation, stated that the European participants in the conversation with Trump were stunned. Stunned by the way the US president described what he and the others had agreed upon. This refers to Trump and Putin. Merkel's office reported that during the conversation, the European leaders promised Trump to increase sanctions pressure, while Trump himself no longer mentioned sanctions at all. In addition, as the publication writes, the conversation was lengthy. President Trump believes that the most important thing is direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. That is his position. Zelensky stated that they talked about this for a long time. In the end, he believes that the Russian side will be sending appropriate signals about how they see a ceasefire, their vision. And he addressed President Trump: if the vision of the Russian Federation is not supported by the Ukrainian side, we would like to have the opportunity to discuss this so that the United States could view it as Russia's unwillingness to end the war, and then certain difficult conditions could be proposed. The Financial Times also writes that European leaders fear that in an attempt to end the war, Trump might strike a deal with Putin that would betray Ukraine's interests. But now this is serious. This is essentially a leak through the Financial Times of what is actually being discussed, what they are really talking about. And naturally, these fears of the Europeans are further heightened by another statement, this time from Yuri Ushakov, Putin's longtime aide. Let me remind you, he is already 83, as far as I remember. Yes, he is a veteran of the old Soviet diplomatic school who made a statement. Let's use the trendy word podcast. But it wasn't actually a podcast, it was just an audio recording of Ushakov's statement. He's still an old school diplomat. He records his statements on a voice recorder, not on video, just on a recorder. This audio recording was published by the propagandist Pavel Zarubin, Putin's favorite boy, his errand boy. So Ushakov stated that Putin and Trump discussed in great detail the war between Russia and Ukraine, as well as bilateral relations. They also agreed on another prisoner exchange following the formula of 9 for 9 people. This will already be the third exchange. 2 have already taken place. The first was in February, the second was in April. They exchanged citizens. Let me remind you, at that time they exchanged Mark Fogel, a school teacher, for Alexander Vinnik, the founder of a crypto exchange who was accused of laundering $4 billion. The second exchange, they exchanged Ksenia Karelina, a citizen of both the US and Russia, who received 12 years for donating to a Ukrainian charity organization. And the US released Artur Petrov, a citizen of Russia and Germany, who had been arrested in Cyprus at the request of the US for exporting dual-use microelectronics, meaning military grade. So here is a direct quote from Ushakov. This is important. The presidents agreed that they would call each other as needed, and Trump said, attention, Vladimir, you can pick up the phone at any time, and I will gladly answer, I will gladly talk with you. This ending also focuses on the nature of the conversation that took place between the leaders. End of quote. That was Ushakov. Let me tell you, it's rare to have conversations of such length when both presidents, neither of them wanted to end the conversation, didn't want, if I may put it this way, to hang up the phone. That's a quote from Ushakov via TASS. Well, as they say, no comment. I'm not even going to comment on that. I think you all understand perfectly well. There aren't even any hints here. It's all being said outright. And most importantly, I'll repeat, with the help of these protocol tricks, Putin refused an immediate ceasefire. See how he slipped away like a piece of coal. Vance said that Trump was going to pressure him, that he was supposed to push him to the end. But as a result of a 2-hour conversation, we see that Putin slipped away. And what does Trump say? Trump says, the conversation took place. It went very well, very well. The tone and spirit of the conversation were excellent. I repeat, if it were otherwise, I would say so right now, not later. So there you have it. Putin slipped away, and Trump said that everything went great, everything went very well. Well, as they say, we shall see. Especially considering the very, I would say, dangerous scenario being described by the German newspaper Bild. The same Bild that published the plans for the occupation of Ukraine, including the offensive from Crimea, the capture of Mariupol, and the advance on Kiev. In other words, let me remind you, this is the publication through which American and British intelligence agencies actively leak real plans. That's why you should read Bild, my friends. It's not a classic tabloid with sensationalist news. It's a real publication that has some very serious insider information. This week, Bild writes that after the war with Ukraine ends, Russia is planning to immediately redeploy its armed forces to the NATO borders. Moreover, as Bild reports, the troops will be moved primarily to the borders with Finland, Norway, and the Baltic states. The greatest threats will be directed at Lithuania and Poland. This concerns the Zapad 2025 exercises, which, I remind you, are joint Russian-Belarusian drills. They will traditionally take place in the fall, and under the guise of maneuvers, the troops will remain there. Moreover, if the war ends, Bild writes, citing its sources, that 800,000 Russian servicemen will not be demobilized. They will not return home. This is already the Minister of Defense of Estonia, Hanno Pevkur. They will receive new orders, If hostilities end, the threat to us will increase. In other words, all of this shows that it is absolutely real. And this is what Europe fears. That is why Europe understands that they need to supply Ukraine with as many weapons as possible so that Ukraine can hold back and wear down the enemy, even at the cost of terrible losses. As we can see, all of this continues on the front lines. This is already going into its fourth year, but Europe does not feel ready, neither militarily nor psychologically, of course, for such a war. They understand that they need to prepare, especially in light of the tactics involving drones, and now even entire motorcycle units, as the Telegraph reports. This experience, which has been in use since April 2024, will now be applied through the creation of entire units using motorcycles in the Russian army. This is what we need to prepare for. This is no longer a Mad Max movie. Unfortunately, friends, this is now our reality. That's the news, friends. Take care of yourselves and subscribe to the channel. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to its armed forces. Glory to the Ukrainian Special Forces. Glory to the Ukrainian Territorial Defense Forces. Take care of yourselves. Major Taras Berezovets of the Ukrainian Army with you. See you next time. Bye-bye.